Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Aubrey Reeves, CEO of Business and Arts. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm a white settler speaking to you from Toronto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat peoples and the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee Confederacies, most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. By saying the names of its original keepers, we remember that this territory continues to be the subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We acknowledge all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on these lands. We also acknowledge that colonialism and inequality is not a thing of past, but continues to impact and shape the lives of individuals and communities today. This includes not just Indigenous peoples, but many groups such as Black and racialized peoples, newcomers, deaf and disabled people, LGBTQ2+, low-income households, and others who do not have equal access to services, resources, and opportunities in our society. As we all know, February is Black History Month, and it is an occasion to celebrate and recognize the contributions that Black Canadians have made to Canada. But it's also a time to consider what structures and supports need to change or to be built to ensure all communities have equal access and individuals can rise to their full potential. For arts organizations, this starts by looking within, including at HR practices. Today's topic will unpack a number of ideas related to equity and inclusion in hiring and retention of staff. We'll get started in a moment, but just a few housekeeping items first. At the end of the session, there will be an open question and answer period, which I will be moderating. Only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on today. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box early and vote for the ones you think are most relevant. The session is scheduled for 1 hour. We are also happy to have ASL interpreters Christopher and Julian from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service with us here today. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to the Speaker Series presenting partner, Power Corporation of Canada, for your support of this important series, and Manulife Financial as supporting partner. And so now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Menon Dwarka is playing the role of moderator today, but I do hope we get to hear some of his own opinions on today's topic. Menon is well known to the Canadian arts community. He's currently the Senior Vice President at Arts Consulting Group. Menon has held Executive Director, Artistic Director, and Community Arts leadership positions in Canada and the United States for over 25 years. Whether implementing project management programs and digital town halls at Soundstreams, winning digital strategy fund grants for Arts at Etobicoke, or introducing electronic music programs with Morton Subanik at the 92nd Street Y Harlem School of Arts and the Greenwich House Music School, Menon's innovative approach to the arts has always resulted in increased audience engagement and community development with a focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. His expertise resides in leveraging technology in service of creating more diverse programming and administrative spaces. He's also a sought-after public speaker and has been featured on CBC Television, WBAI Radio, TV Ontario's The Agenda, and The Walrus Talks. He's also appeared on a regular recurring segment on Sesame Street. He was part of the inaugural cohort of the Banff Toronto Arts Council Cultural Leaders Lab, as well as City of Toronto's Economic Development and Culture Strategic Planning Committee, which oversaw the creation of Toronto's 2018 to 2022 Cultural Plan, which is coming to an end very soon. In addition, Menon served as support lead for the Metcalfe Foundation's Creative Strategic Incubator and is chair of Hamlet College's Program Advisory Committee, and finally, the Canadian Opera Company's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. So joining Menon today is Rosemary Thompson. Rosemary is the Executive Director of the Coalition for a Better Future, which is a broad-based group of 127 organizations and counting from the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, working together on an ambitious plan for economic growth that is inclusive and sustainable for Canada as we emerge from the pandemic. Rosemary has served as a senior executive at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, the National Gallery of Canada, and the National Arts Centre. Before her career in the arts, she was one of Canada's most experienced journalists, having served as Montreal Bureau Chief of CTV National News during the 1995 referendum and as Washington correspondent for CTV National News during 9/11. She was the longtime Deputy Bureau Chief of the Parliamentary Bureau who covered 7 election campaigns in Canada and the United States. And thirdly, we are joined by Ikem Opara. Ikem is an equity, diversity, and inclusion professional focused on creating systems and building communities and social structures that work for all. A connector by nature, his career has included hyper-local projects across Canada, as well as supporting international development programs in Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Nepal, and Cuba. So he's very well traveled. His focus is on belonging, identity, social cohesion, and redefining citizenship as action instead of as a classification. Ikem spends his time reading and writing about the conversations that people engage in to build better bridges within and across communities. One of his favorite questions is, how does that make things better? He is currently the Director of National Learning Partnerships at the Rideau Hall Foundation. And so with that, I welcome our 3 guests and I hand it over to our moderator.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say that it's a real pleasure and for all of us here to be speaking today. And I wanted to just kick it off because I know we actually don't have that much time. We did have a pre-meeting a few days ago, and I think it was interesting that everyone wanted this to be a super positive story and that we wanted to share. It wasn't gloom and doom. So Rosemary, I'll direct my first question to you. So there's been labor shortages affecting all sectors right now. And I think it's important when we have these discussions for the proper framing. So I think you may have some data to share with us that could help us not be, kind of put us squarely where we are right now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to bring up the slides. Here they go. One moment, please. Great. Listen, thank you so much for inviting me to come today. Business for the Arts, by the way, or Business Arts, I always forget. Business Arts is a member of the Coalition for a Better Future. So for everybody on the call today, I was in the arts for a long, long time. But in the fall, I joined this coalition that's really focused on improving the economy as we come out of the pandemic. And the arts, we've made a very specific reach out to the arts community because we believe the art should always be at the table when you're rebuilding your community and your economy. So as part of that, I got some data from Statistics Canada because they're one of our partners to just take us through what's happened with jobs and the arts over the last couple of years. So here we go. So we have a very unusual situation right now in Canada. It's only cropped up in the last year or so. And we have an extraordinary number of jobs that are open right now. 913,000 jobs, almost 1 million jobs are unfilled in Canada right now. And of those jobs, 16,500 exist in the arts, culture, recreation, and sports. So it sounds fantastic to have 1 million jobs open. But the flip side of that is it's because of demographics. It's because people are retiring. The boomers are finally moving on to into their retirement years. And we don't have a big enough birth rate. And so we need immigrants, of course. More immigration is important for economic growth in Canada. And so while it looks fantastic to have 913,000 jobs open, it means that this is one of the big demographic challenges that we're all going to have to face over the next 20 to 30 years. So what happened to the arts during the pandemic? So StatsCan measures arts jobs with arts, entertainment, and recreation. That's where we are put together. So in February of 2020, so just before the pandemic started, we had 314,500 jobs in the arts. It crashed 134,000 in May of 2020, and we all know about what happened. It was incredibly difficult. But we have had a recovery. So the good news is we're up to 270,000 jobs in the arts. But of course, we have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And what's interesting about that is that in the overall economy, we have had a total recovery, but the arts has not quite come back. And I think we all know why. It's because of the ongoing restrictions. So the impact on the performing arts and spectator sports, again, we get glommed in with spectator sports and the arts. We had 63,000 jobs in 2020. July, that was the crash of 2020, 30,000, so halved. Wow, it was hard. And we all know it, those of us that were in the arts. It was heartbreaking. And again, we've had a recovery to 46,000, but again, we haven't quite gotten to where we need to go. So I think that it behooves us as we reopen to get the audiences back and get the revenue going so that we can bring more and more artists and art workers back to the workforce. So there is one bright light in all of these numbers, and it's motion pictures and video industries. So again, 66,000 jobs before as the pandemic began. It dropped tremendously as well, but it has now surpassed. We're at 68,000 jobs now in motion pictures, video industry. So people that were photographers, graphic artists, technicians, people that were in broadcast, creative designers, craftspeople, they were hurt at the beginning, but now are largely unscathed, which is fantastic. So I would argue, this was called the Great Resignation. I would argue that this has not been the Great Resignation, but it was the Great Layoff of 2020. And now we're rebuilding the sector, and we face big labor shortages, not just in the arts, but across the economy. So you have to be able to attract and retain. I think retain is the big word here. You want to be able to hold your workforce and make sure that the workforce is a great place for a new generation of artists and technical staff.
Great, thank you for that. I actually have a question. I'm going to move on to Karim in a second, but Rosemary, do you have any thoughts about how this is different than 2008 or 9/11 or any of these other huge impacts on our society? Is this wildly different than those, or is it similar in your mind? It could just be anecdotal too. I'm just curious of your thoughts.
You know, I covered 9/11. I can't believe you asked this question. 9/11 was horrific. You know, it was, but I was in Washington during 9/11 and you know, covered. I was at the White House that day, and it was very scary. However, very quickly, within about 10 days, the leadership in the United States said, open the theaters. We need to open the theaters, get out there. And, you know, that was what Rudy Giuliani actually said in New York, please open the theaters. We need Americans or the public to go back to the art. And it was the same feeling in Washington. You know, it was, I remember George Bush said, you know, when the going gets tough, the tough start shopping. So it was the same kind of feeling that, you know, you got to get out there and support the economy. But I would argue this time, I think the arts have been unfairly, really unfairly treated throughout the entire pandemic. For sure, we had to have good distancing and all the rest. But, you know, I always felt when I was working in the sector during this time that if I can go to Walmart and buy something, why can't I go into a gallery or a museum, for instance, or, you know, in the best case scenario, have some concerts with social distancing. And I have to credit everybody in the industry that worked so hard to bring the audiences back, because we all know the arts are so healing.
I was curious because I was in New York City for both 9/11 and the 2008, you know, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and this does feel different. So, Karim, I want to ask you, you know, you've been in the nonprofit sector for most of your career, and I'd love to know, what's your view of it from your standpoint? Like, what are you seeing in your organization and elsewhere?
Thank you very much. I think to echo some of what Rosemary said, there's been a dip, and there are glimmers that things are changing. That change, however, from what we're seeing, is not entirely across the board. There are definitely some trends or some threads in that change that are reminiscent of some of the inequities that we've been seeing in society for a long time. I like to say, and I've heard others say, that the experience of this pandemic has, you know, definitely shone a spotlight on some of the places where our social structures and our systems are quite fragile. and our experience of them are quite inequitable. And one of those places is the experience of the nonprofit sector, where a lot of folks, particularly in that sort of crossover point of the nonprofit sector and the arts, a lot of folks in these spaces are the people who are very, very deeply involved in community arts, deeply involved in that pipeline of getting people who might otherwise not be engaged in the arts to get engaged in the arts, or are engaged in the arts but don't know that they're engaged in the arts. There's a lot of that kind of work that happens at the nonprofit, at the community level, that is entirely dependent on people physically getting together in a space, or people entering into some kind of performance environment or a creative environment together. And having to be separate for so long has had a significant impact on many of those organizations at the grassroots level, especially, that we typically support quite strongly in the nonprofit sector. It's also meant that there has been some shifting in the priorities of staff, funders, all of the people who kind of support the sector to continue to move along. I think our narrative as a culture about the importance, and to Rosemary's point, the healing nature of the arts has sometimes not been a part of the conversation in the ways we be more proactive in designing a social interaction space that is actually resilient. At some point, when things are good, we sometimes do a good job of understanding and investigating things like the economic impact of the arts, for instance, and certain art forms and ways of expression and others. But that aspect of the arts as the mortar that binds community together, and as a place where we get to interact in ways that are deeper than our usual surface interactions as community, I think has been quite lost in this period. And in the sector, yes, there have been layoffs. Yes, there have been resignations. I'm one of those people who resigned a job that I at an employer that I absolutely loved. But the motivation was to go to another employer that is equally phenomenal, to do work that I'm very, very interested and passionate about. So one thing I have seen in my sector is movement. A high rate of, not turnover, but the different opportunities coming up that folks may not have otherwise been able to access, that organizations might not have thought were possible to hire or recruit in these communities in these ways. The fact that many of us are having to pivot to working remotely has made that quite possible. On the other hand, that remote work does not come without its fair share of challenges. There is a huge privilege to be able to sit in a quiet, warm space with good tech and typically stable internet connections and have these kinds of conversations as a part of your job. That's not the case for every function in every organization and for every staff person. There are people in my organizations and other organizations around the place who, the opportunity to leave their home and go to work was a really important part of their day and identity. And we all, I live in a part of the country where we like to complain a lot about our commute, justifiably so. But there is something that is also, at least for me, I'm odd that way. I love public transit and the experience of public transit. But there's something missing about, rocketing to work with 2,000 of your closest friends in a steel underground tube that allows for that rubbing of shoulders and that mass of humanity that is also part of how we get to interact as a community, that is missing now, because my commute literally is from my kitchen table to a computer where I have these kinds of conversations.
And I think to your point about opportunity and churn, I think in one of our pre-meetings, we had noted that maybe everybody on the screen of the 5 or 6 of us that were in that Zoom room had all started new jobs. So there is this churn that's going on. And as I stated at the top, we're a positive bunch, and we wanted to make this, not just doom and gloom. Rosemary, I'm curious if you have thoughts on maybe some practical solutions that may be available to us, and what kind of pressures are on the labor market in general, but especially in the arts and culture sector.
Well, you know, it's really interesting to be at the perch that I'm at right now because we're basically looking at the entire economy. And what I can tell you is it's going to be incredibly competitive for everybody. Doesn't matter what sector you're in to get talent and talent and the people with the skills that you need. And so people that might have been in the arts, who might have left the arts and gone into other things, we're going to have to be very attractive employers to attract the talent back to the arts. And so because they may have moved into marketing or creative sector, who knows where they went, but they've landed somewhere, or some of them have landed somewhere else. And probably their hearts are still very tied to the arts, but we have to make these arts jobs very, very attractive. So one of the things that I've learned in the last 6 months, being sort of out of, you know, day-to-day arts, is partnerships and collaboration are incredibly important. So it's great that Business Arts is doing this panel today, but there is an organization in the private sector called, well, it's a not-for-profit, but it connects the private sector with all of the schools, either the colleges or the universities. It's called Business for Higher Education Roundtable. And 97% of the colleges and universities in this country are members of that roundtable. And they literally help bridge the talent question from the schools into the workforce. And I would encourage all of the art schools and all of the training schools in the arts to be part of this roundtable, because it's going to be extremely competitive to get graduates to go into any sector, including the arts.
That's great. So just in keeping with that kind of maybe the funnel into our sector, Karim, I'm curious if you think, you know, I mean, we were all kind of railing against, not railing, that's too strong a word, but rethinking this Great Resignation moniker. And I think that we also maybe talked about this Great Reformation, a chance to kind of change and restructure things. Karim, I'm curious about your thoughts about internal HR practices and how we kind of keep people in the pool once they're trained and get delivered into our sector. How do we keep them there?
I think giving folks a reason. I mean, when you have what is shaping up to be a glut of, you know, well-talented, motivated, you know, potential hires, you've got to give people a reason other than the availability of work to stay. And I think the employers and organizations that are able to do that are the ones that are able to create a very strong through thread between their mission, the reason they exist as an organization, and every single aspect of my life as a staff member or as a volunteer or as a board director with their organization. I think we will continue to see more of what we're seeing a little bit now on the consumer side, when folks are being quite insistent that the brands that they spend their money on speak to their soul and speak to their philosophy and the way they see the world. I think it's become more important that employers of all stripes are able to do that and be quite mission focused in ways that are not lip service. I think when it comes to hiring, I mean, when we were having the conversation, I joked that, you know, there's a writer in the nonprofit sector, Boo Lee, who many of you might know, who puts out this blog every so often. And so I think the topic is, or the name of the blog is Nonprofits AF. It's a bit tongue in cheek. And he had this recent post about crappy hiring practices that need to die. And some of them are quite, you know, interesting. It's, you know, getting away from some of the archaic and, you know, old ways of relating with folks that you're looking to employ, and vice versa. I think that's one way of changing the way the conversation is had, where, you know, a job interview, for instance, ought to actually be a conversation between both parties. At the same time, you're potentially going to hire someone. That person is potentially about to make a decision about how much time they want to spend in your company, how much time they want to, you know, invest of their lives doing the things that your company espouses as their goal. So, and I think that is going to become more and more important. And, you know, to the point that Rosemary made earlier about the Business and Higher Education Roundtable, linking all that to a strong pipeline to connect young people, those who are seeking training, capacity building, and learning, to those opportunities and organizations is all of our shared responsibility. Where I work, one of our main programs, Catapult Canada, is focused particularly on that, is bringing learners along the entire continuum of learning and opening up the opportunity, more doors along that entire continuum for people to be able to learn what they want to learn, get the skills they need for jobs that they don't even know are available yet. I think that's kind of how we need to continue to think about this in a more future-focused way.
That's great. That's great, Ikem. And maybe for the both of you now, I could say, if we just had some conversations about the kind of conversation we want to have internally, I'd love to know everyone's thoughts about how do we change the intake of who's at the table for this conversation. So we've had this period now of some breaking apart of some old things and maybe some opportunity to reform some things. I'm curious if either of you have thoughts about, could we make this space more porous for BIPOC women, for women who have left the sector? How can we, if there is a crack in the wall or a chink in the armor right now, what can we do to kind of open up this space to more people? I'm very curious to what either of you think about this.
Well, this is something that I think is really interesting, which is not to hire one person, but to hire many. So it's called a cluster hire, right? So you hire 3 BIPOC people or 5 BIPOC people, and that they're not necessarily working together, but they are, they're collaborating in a larger organization, because there's nothing worse than being isolated in a great big institution, right? And I've seen that happen over the course of the pandemic, and I applaud it, because it's the right thing to do. I think that's incredibly important. I'd love to hear Ikem's thoughts on that. What do you think?
I mean, not surprisingly, I do agree with you. I think cluster hires are a very powerful antidote to some of the isolating experience that anybody who ends up being in a place where you end up representing an entire constituency when you enter into an organization. I saw this joke somewhere that if some organizations say that they can't find the talent, they don't have the time, they don't know where to look, and all of that kind of stuff. And someone's made the joke recently that if Beyonce can find 25 Black trombone players to do a concert, you can find whatever number of Black, Indigenous women. Like, you can, if you actually do value that as a part of improving your ability to connect to community. And the data is there that being more inclusive, truly inclusive, not in a performative way, but being more inclusive in a real way, is better for business, is better for your bottom line, is better for the longevity of your organization. And it makes the workplace a more interesting, tapestry for people to spend their time in.
That's great, Karim. I'm curious, Ikem, sorry, that one of the things I noticed in your bio is that you're doing this design degree at OCAD, which I think is interesting, from many standpoints. But I'm curious if that design thinking has had any impact on the way you're learning or thinking about capacity building or career pathways in the industry.
Absolutely. When I was making the decision about what field of study I wanted to go into after my earlier education, I knew I didn't want to do a traditional postgraduate degree in political science to political theory, which was my training. Having a program like this at OCAD-U that is very, very multidisciplinary, and my cohort at the Strategic Foresight and Innovation program, it's about 24 of us or so. And there's folks from the nonprofit sector, there's people from the military, there's people from banks, there's teachers, nurses, there's lawyers, there's engineers. And we're all working together in a cohort to challenge and stretch the ways we practically and philosophically think about how to intentionally design the future. I mean, it is quite an ambitious undertaking, but it forces us to intentionally do things that we keep doing unintentionally every day. I like to say that if we don't plan for what the future, and we talk about climate resiliency and social justice and all of those things, if we don't do the work now to plan and design for those futures, we are essentially by default designing a poor version of that future, right? So yeah, certainly that experience continues to inform how I'm doing my work here at Rideau Hall Foundation, how my interactions with community about what is possible are framed.
That's great. Thank you for that. Rosemary, we're at the part of the conversation where we talk about the money Lebowski, in the sense of, we don't have the same fulcrum that for-profit companies have in order to keep competitive salaries. And even if we look at, I think I've mentioned in our private meeting before, I'm seeing the differences in salaries between American and Canadian arts institutions. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how we can address this gap in terms of talent retention, and how we can keep this sector robust and thriving if we don't have that lever to pull all the time.
Well, I hate to tell you this, the sector is going to have to respond to the market, and the market is moving up, and the workers really have the upper hand now. And I actually think that's a good thing, because it means that we're going to have to prioritize and treat artists and arts workers better. And it's interesting. I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and some people were saying, well, what they're paying at Tim Hortons in Toronto right now, an hour, it's $21.50. $21.50, minimum wage is $15. Well, $21.50, and of course the living wage just to live in Toronto, is $22 an hour. So the reality is that if we're going to speak to our purpose, what is our purpose? What is our vision? What is our mission? So if our purpose is to improve the lives of artists, or if that's our purpose in an arts organization, we're going to have to remunerate artists better and have better conditions. And I actually think that's a great thing. I really do. And I'll give you one little anecdote. So when I worked for the National Arts Centre, we had this amazing CEO, Peter Herndorf, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. And he had a great CFO, Danny Senek. And every year, Danny Senek would produce a graph, and it showed how much money was being spent in the back office and how much money was being spent on the stage. And Peter Herndorf wanted all of us to spend less on the back office and more on the stage. And just having that graph kept us honest with each other, that we were spending more on art than we were on administration. And so I would encourage all of us to go back to our purpose, go back to our mission, go back to our vision, and make sure that the money is being spent where it should be spent.
That's great. Thank you. So we're in our kind of last chunk of questions, and this is for all of us. And I'm curious to know what everyone thinks what the future will look like. Maybe I'll just stick my foot in the door here and just say that for me, what's really, really been evident to me is that this dislocation of geography and work, I think this is only the beginning. The number of projects I'm working on across North America is astounding, and business is booming on for people who can deliver expertise in a timely, cost-effective manner with an understanding of local markets and with local people on the ground. So to me, I just see if people can understand that while a smaller market may not be able to support your economic activity, maybe the whole continent can. And there are, I think, people here who are willing to lattice people up and give them a leg up into that space. But I'm curious, Ikem or Rosemary, what do you think the future looks like?
I'll jump in and say I think the future looks bright. I am a parent, so I have to skew towards the optimistic, and also because we've done this before. We have evidence of artistic communities turning into industries that overflowed the banks of their local communities and became international phenomena. One for me growing up was Bollywood. I grew up in southeastern Nigeria, and I cannot tell you how many Bollywood movies I watched growing up, but I had no idea, where exactly they were made, what the conditions of the artistic environment was where they were made, other than the country that they came from and how entertaining that they were. So yes, the separation of geography from the source of the art and from the consumers of the art is happening a lot now. But if we can take some examples of how in over the centuries we've had arts travel, right? I think I like to say that our arts and culture are the most portable aspects of our civilizations. We have a lot of human migration going on across the world right now, and it has been prior to the pandemic and will continue. How we continue to value arts that don't look like the arts that we are used to seeing or used to hearing or used to experiencing, the way we keep creating those creoles of artistic expression as people move from one part of the world to the other is how the future will look. I think that the future will look very syncretic. It will look a lot more, colorful and multilingual and with many different ways of expressing ourselves and engaging with one another than we have today. It will be that way out of necessity. And it also will that way because it's so much more interesting and exciting to get into those ways of knowing and being that, we're not used to.
That's great. Rosemary, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm coming to you from the National Capital Region, from Ottawa. That's where I live. And I got to tell you, just coming out of the last month has been horrific. And this city and this country needs healing badly. And I've always believed that the arts is the source of so much. It's a way for people to come together. It's a way to understand difficult things. It's a way to have tough conversations. And I think this country needs the arts more than it's ever needed it before. And I mean, I think we've always needed it, but I think this is the time when we really need it. And so I'm encouraged by that. And I do believe it will happen. I'm also encouraged by how attentive different funders are. So for instance, in January, I got a call out of the blue when Mirvish was having the trouble with Come From Away. I got a call from the blue from somebody at Heritage saying, what do we do? And it's like, well, actually, I'm actually working at the Coalition for a Better Future, but if I was, at the NAC or somewhere else, this is what I would do. And guess what? They did it. They are attentive to what's going on. They are concerned. The other thing I would say is that, Canada is known for art and artists first in the world, internationally. When you ask somebody globally what they know about Canada, they'll say names like Margaret Atwood or Drake, or Saturday Night Live. That's what they know about Canada. And so I think our artists are the ones who are going to pull us back into a more optimistic future.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Maybe I will call back on Aubrey to come in the fray about the Q&A questions we're coming up to.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. The discussion has really sparked some interesting ones. Off the top, just a couple quick ones about the Stats Canada data. So this is for Rosemary. One person asking is, do these art stats reflect cultural heritage and museums jobs? And then the other one is asking about the definition of jobs in this data. Are they full-time employment only, or does it include independent contractors?
So good question. So the independent contractors are separate from this. These were full-time jobs that I was showing you in this data. And I can break it out. They were very, very good to me. They sent me breakdowns of different sectors. So I couldn't get into absolutely every single sector, but I showed you sort of macro, but there is a separate sector for heritage and museums. You're right.
Mm-hmm. And if anybody also wants to dig in deeply to the employment numbers as well as GDP numbers, check out the Capacoa blog, because Frédéric Julien is always doing analysis of the Stats Can's data so that it is accessible in that way. Okay, another question is there any research related to arts organization leadership versus the industry in general? So they're saying that they fear for the exhaustion and drop off of leadership.
Wow, good question.
Would also be able to address this. Yeah. Are we losing our leaders, essentially, is the question.
I think there's a few that know that they can, when it's a tipping point. I won't name this person, but I remember a colleague of mine saying, I got to do something about my retirement now, and was offered a much lucrative position in private sector. But people don't go. The forces that would move someone out of the arts it can't just be monetary because they've always had that choice for their whole career, right? So I think, and to Rosemary's point, you know, we need healing. We need people to, I mean, we at least need more people to teach people to get better renditions of the national anthem on the streets of Ottawa, if I could just be cheeky for a moment. But, but Rosemary, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, okay, so I'm going to go macro again. Guess what? It's happening across the board. You know, God bless the boomers. They hung on for a long time. You know, it's I'm an X. I'm just at the cusp of X. And so what's interesting is that it's demographics, and we have to face this. It's in the next 10 years. That incredibly big generation post World War II is going to be out of the workforce. And so it's just going to happen everywhere. So I don't think we should, I mean, obviously you want to hold on to your best leaders as long as you can and make them, you know, make them feel valued. There's actually a lot of research that says we should try and get people to stay in the workforce longer, because we are going to have such a large labor shortage in this country. It's all about demographics. So I think, you know, we honor those that are in there and doing a great job, but then also it's great to bring other people up the ranks. So good. It's so positive, you know, younger ideas, different perspectives. So guess what? There's going to be lots of opportunity in leadership roles in the next decade. There's no question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, an interesting segue. Since we're talking about retirement of boomers, one of the things affecting our industry is the lack of pensions for arts workers. If we want retention and the ability to properly plan for succession, our people need pensions. So it's not more of a comment than a question, but maybe you could speak to that.
I'll start. I agree.
Sure.
I think that's definitely important. I mean, and pensions we also need to continue to think of them as coming in many different forms, right? I think it might, the traditional notion of, you know, you work until a certain point and then you get the Rolex and the pension, I think might not be accessible for many workers, regardless of industry. And, you know, that promise of a carrot at the end is also, I think is very difficult to make sense for this particular sector, where folks might move from one place of employment to the other, from one industry to the other, from one city to another, for many different reasons, right? So sometimes I think that conversation comes to what employers are doing now with their current staff to set them up later to be more financially stable and sustainable when they're no longer in those most active parts of their careers. And to Rosemary's point, I think we've got to extend the clock and make it possible for people who want to and are able to continue to work to bring their expertise and time on task to this labor shortage that we're looking at.
I also think real quickly that, you know, what do we need retirement and pensions for? For a lot of people, it's housing, right? And we need to figure out a national strategy so that our best workers are not unhoused in their most vulnerable years. You know, I think that we don't need all this money. We don't need all this.
So true.
No.
You know, like the data is incredible. We're bringing in, which is fantastic, 420,000 immigrants a year to Canada, which is, they are our growth as a country. Honestly, immigration, they actually say in the next 5 to 10 years, 100%, many of the new jobs will go to 100% of immigrants. There'll be immigrants that will be taking on these roles. So thankfully everyone's coming and still coming. But again, to your point, Menon, it's housing. We have a shortage of housing. So we're inviting people in, but we're not giving them good places to live. So it's a fascinating time in this country. We've got a lot of big sort of tectonic plate style issues that are coming at us. And that's why it's so good that we can speak to each other and work cross-sectorally to start to ensure that we're dealing with these questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question says, to Rosemary's point about retention, I wonder if she, Menon, or Ikem have any reflections on positive changes they've seen or would suggest to improve HR supports for staff to help retain staff. Any examples, say, around the 4-day work week, mental health or personal days, improving work-life balance, etc.?
I will say two really quick things. One is that I think there has to be a recognition within the sector that most of us are not trained in HR. And so we're not availing ourselves of the expertise that's in the collective room of these large cities that we're in. And I've forgotten my second point, so I'll pass off to someone else.
Well, retention is going to be huge because it's always easier to hold on to an employee than to recruit an employee. And you think of the sort of the churn is never good for stability on a team. You want to have a strong, stable team that can do things together. So I think, again, the workforce has the upper hand, which is, I think, fantastic because it means you have to have a more human workplace. So I think education, lifelong education, to have training for people throughout their careers, that they can feel that they're growing. And so, whether their salaries are growing or not, at least they're getting some really interesting educational opportunities. There's a lot of conversation about reskilling and upskilling, and there's all kinds of programs that the federal government is working on right now so that people are always, right on the right edge of whatever skills they need. And I think we need, mental health supports. Listen, we were all in the sanctity of each other's homes through the pandemic. It was very personal in a way, wasn't it? To get to know each other inside their homes. And I think in some ways it made you understand that some of your staff were struggling. And so to be a good leader in that situation and to reach out and to make sure that your staff's okay.
If I can just add on my second point, which Rosemary helped me remember, is that it's the same as the HR piece. So along mental health lines, many of you may or may not know that if a therapist, if you research a therapist and they have an MD beside their name, that also means that they're covered by our universal health care. So I know many of us feel like I can't see a therapist, I can't do this. You actually can. It just takes a little legwork. I see someone twice a week, in fact, and that person has helped me get through most of this pandemic. But it's part of our national health care and security net. So let's avail ourselves of these things. Let's not say we're counted out of the game. We have a place at that table. Let's use it.
I would add that the environment that we've been talking about and the tone being set by leaders in our organizations definitely makes that retention piece possible. The tone that is set about the expectation of productivity. I mean, we have this conversation all the time about potentially going to a 4-day work week and stuff like that. But I think it's a bit of a red herring unless the culture of productivity isn't addressed. We will, I wouldn't want to see a situation where we condense what we're doing now in 5 days into 4 days, and we have a 4-day work week. But the expectation to churn out as much, as often, and with greater connectivity, being able to be on call and reachable all the time, leads us to go deeper into blurring those lines between the things we do for work and who we are as people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. It was a really great example that you gave, Rosemary, about the cluster hiring. But this question is, how do we help with that isolation in a small arts organization that cannot cluster hire? They're only hiring one at a time. They just have the finances for that. Any tips?
Well, yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's always hard to be the one and only. It's always hard. It's just a really tough position to be in. But I also believe that you can have a broader life beyond your workplace, which is through volunteer work. And I've always done that over the course of my career. When there weren't many women in journalism, I always joined the famous 5 in Equal Voice, because I had community of women that were working in politics. There weren't that many of us back then, and it gave me strength. So I think if you can't find it in the office, you can find it through volunteer. I found it through volunteer work generally.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can add to that question about not being able to hire in clusters, I think a solution that I have seen some organizations take is seeing their hiring over a long period of time and being intentional that, okay, we're not going to be able to hire 5 Indigenous staff in this moment, but the next 5 will be, and we will prioritize that, and we will we will show our work and be open with the public that this is why we are hiring in this way, recruiting in this way, even though we can't do it all at the same time. But there is intentionality to the design of our staffing model because we're trying to do things in a particular way. It also signals to folks like myself who work with funders, when that information filters through in your applications, in your communications materials, that this is the way you are prioritizing the building your team and connecting with community in a way that recognizes that your community are more than your audience. There are also creators. There are also sources of expertise that allow your organization to be as relevant as it can over time.
Mm-hmm. There are still many questions, but we're not going to be able to get to them all. So I'm going to go to this last one. Generally speaking, the sector's ability to offer competitive conditions to workers and artists in Canada depends heavily on the level of public investment in the arts. What do you think the sector should be doing to encourage continued government investment, which is a necessary precursor to putting in place a lot of the changes that we have been talking about today?
I
Well,
might just turn that
you're
around.
doing
Sorry,
it
go
right
ahead,
now.
Rosemary.
You mobilize, you mobilize, you get together, you start talking about it, you speak with a common voice, you speak with a common voice, and you get invited to those big economic tables around the recovery right now. And for instance, the coalition is one of those tables. It's, it's where we're trying to bring all kinds of sectors together to really advocate for economic growth that is inclusive and sustainable. So that's what I would say. It's mobilization is very, very important.
The only thing I'll add to that is that just seeing the 990s of so many American organizations and seeing where their funding comes from, I think it's time that we open up private sector. I mean, I know that government is really important here, but the degree to which the American institutions are relying on private investment is just astonishing. I think I communicated with my colleagues. We were putting in a bid for a community arts organization in Midtown Manhattan, which the outgoing ED has a salary in excess of $400,000.
Oh.
I know it's a lot, but we do have resources. This is the GTA in particular is a very resource-rich area, as well as other parts of Canada. I think we can do a little bit better, but I think putting all of our eggs into the government basket, I think this is a missed opportunity if we don't expand that circle now.
I agree with you, Menon. I mean, it's when we see some of the gifts that have happened recently, what was it, 100 million for the Vancouver Art Gallery, 35 million from the Shaw family last week to have free admission to the Glenbow. And part of it is an endowment and part of it is a spend down fund. Like, wow. I mean, there are some very wealthy families and foundations in this country that could do those types of things. And again, they do make a tremendous difference.
Mm-hmm.
I always say that having also worked for a government funder, the staying in the conversation is more important and impactful. I think that folks sometimes realize how much funders listen to the ether, how much policymakers and elected officials listen to what is being said about them and their decisions in the public. I think the power of the arts and the power of the arts as an industry and a sector is sometimes, and forgive me for saying this, I think the sector does not always understand how powerful and how much of a power place that they occupy. Someone cheekily told me once that the greatest nationalist tool every government has is their national anthem. It's a song. It's a piece of art. A flag is a piece of art. When you start to decode or decipher all of the, icons of power and in society, a lot of them stem from the arts and stem from the ways people have used arts to motivate people to make decisions and do things. So if you can use a song to rally people to invade a country, I think you can challenge ourselves to use a song to rally people to improve their communities.
That's a beautiful thought to end us on. Thank you. So I would like to say a huge thank you to everyone involved in another fascinating discussion. And as Menon mentioned earlier, I think it's really interesting to note that everyone involved today, including myself, started a new position during the pandemic. And for various reasons, we all felt it was time to shift organizations and try something new. And it has been a really positive experience, speaking for myself, but I think from the conversations, it's pretty clear that's been positive for everyone else as well. So, but I'm also happy to know that it opened up an opportunity for someone new to take on a leadership role in the organization I left. So as individual arts organizations tend to have very short internal career ladders, it's really necessary to have that mobilization and circulation between organizations for that career growth to happen in the sector. So it's great to have that positive perspective on it on today's conversation. So many thanks to our amazing guests, Ikem, Opara, Rosemary Thompson, and moderator Menon Dwarka. You've presented some really thought-provoking ideas about hiring and, really importantly, retaining and supporting our staff in their work and careers so that we can all have thriving organizations. So thank you also to our audience for contributing those thought-provoking questions. I want to say a big thank you to Power Corporation of Canada as presenting sponsor for the speaker series in 2022. Every month, Business and Arts invites industry leaders from across the business and arts sector to share advice, insight, and best practices. It's been a privilege to help bring these types of conversations to the fore nationally, and we hope that everyone here today has found it enriching. I'd also like to thank Manulife Financial, who's the supporting partner for the series. You can visit businessandarts.org to learn more about the upcoming speaker series webinars and other programs. And you can also follow us on social media for the latest news. So many thanks and stay safe, everyone.